Uh, Greetings to everyone this late afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Climate Justice Charter Movement Dialogues, this being the CJCM Workers and Trade Union Assembly. The CJCM Hybrid Conference held on the 23rd and 24th of March this year mandated us to hold a trade union and workers' assembly on the just transition. The purpose of the assembly is to discuss trade unions and workers' concerns, challenges, and approaches to the just transition, as well as the response of the CJCM. The conference also resolved that we need a CJCM workers and trade union forum that at the least will meet once a month to discuss approaches to the just transition, to workshop on the tools the CJCM has developed over the years, and to strengthen worker and community alliances to ensure a deep and a just transition. Also, as part of our ongoing policy work, transforming the vision of the Climate Justice Charter into policies, on Earth Day, we launched the Rights of Nature and Natural Climate Solutions Policy, which has inspired debates on bioregions, decolonial convivial conservation, sacred spaces, and basically transforming our relationship with nature. Over 4 environmental organizations have endorsed the Charter since the launch of our Rights of Nature policy, taking the total number of organizations that have endorsed the Charter to 281. Today, we are launching the Eco-Mobility and Clean Energy Public Transport Policy. Also, it is a draft policy for public engagement. And we encourage everyone, as well as from unions and workers, for feedback on any of these policies. And we encourage everyone who wants to join a working group on any of our policies to join the CJCM to be part of the working group. Today's proceedings are as follows. Vish will chair the first session where we engage with workers and trade unions and hear their concerns and challenges and approaches to the just transition. The session thereafter will be the CJCM response chaired by Stacey. Awande will chair the final session on the launch of the policy. Again, thank you for everyone for joining us this late afternoon. Over to you, Vish. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to comrades for your attendance. We've had over 117, hopefully workers and trade unionists register for this event, and we hope more of them will join us along the way. Without further ado, we've invited all the federations doing work on the just transition to come and share with us for a few minutes their approach to the just transition, and to talk a little bit about the challenges that they are facing, and maybe propose some ideas for a way forward to tackle these challenges. Without a sort of ranking of importance or anything, I'd just like to kick off with Tarona Mudli from NAPTOSA. NAPTOSA is an affiliate of FEDUSA, and we'd like to hear from them, and then we'll hand on to others.
Hi, good afternoon, all. I'm just going to share my screen. Let me just get this down here. Thank you for inviting me. I must say that, Professor, you know that you're my inspiration. I am a student still. And I was first really exposed to this whole situation or this crisis that we are in through Professor Satkar. So thank you so much. NAPTOSA is actually a teacher union with the National Professional Teachers Organization. And we're the second largest teacher union or the education union in the country. At the outset, I just want to place on record that it is not just our members' interests that we serve. In terms of the Constitution as well, we serve the learners' interests in a really big way. And seeing this just transition and the whole climate context, we have to see it in the context of our learners and the future. What does the future really hold for them? So we are committed to the just transition. We are committed to fighting for our planet and also ensuring, from a union's perspective, job security and decent working conditions for all our members. As the introduction did indicate, we are affiliated to FEDUSA as well as Education International. And we have a shared respect to actually protect our learners and our members in this whole conversation that we're going to be having. So there are certain things that I thought is important for the audience to know that NAPTOSA acknowledges, because we do know there are many naysayers out there who don't acknowledge that there is crisis or a huge the situation that we are in deserves attention. So we do acknowledge that the climate change debate and conversation is a trade union debate. It's a trade union issue, and it's in the trade union's interests. We also acknowledge that, of course, it's real and it threatens our existence. We have to acknowledge the protection of existing jobs and also organize in new quality jobs in a green economy. We must fight for just transition measures so that no one is left behind. A low carbon economy must be fair. It must be phased in and managed to ensure no economic disruption and hardship for the poor and the vulnerable workers. And government must create enabling conditions for sustainable enterprises in a flourishing economy and decent work for all. So basically, this is our starting point, and this is our position at the moment. Can I change my slide? We further acknowledge that we are closer than ever to the 2-degree increase in the Earth's temperature, that the extreme weather conditions like floods, heat waves, and fires are becoming a regular occurrence. The economic impact on climate change, the rise in sea levels, as well as the impact of climate change on vulnerable and poor societies are seen to be extraordinary. And we saw this actually in the floods that took place in KZN last year. We're also seeing real floods devastating floods in the Eastern Cape at this moment after 10 years of drought. So that is quite unusual. So we want to really home in onto the impact of climate change on poor and women. And we really believe that this is an opportunity for us to get right what we didn't get right in terms of equity for all, in terms of gender, and looking at how it is that this fresh start can give women more opportunity in terms of new jobs and different kinds of jobs, because women right now are so underrepresented in certain kinds of jobs and many lack the technical skills. So this gives us as a country an opportunity to actually create the balance between the genders in terms of the industries that they occupy. We acknowledge further that South Africa has not left the starting blocks, that we've paid lip service to many of the issues that give rise to climate change. We've not seen any tangible movements to it. We further align ourselves to the Million Climate Jobs campaign, and we see the potential in the country to create climate jobs that reduce high unemployment. We also see the potential in solar, wind, wave, tidal, current, and power generation options. And of course, providing a safe public transport network, insulating buildings, and of course, giving workers the opportunity to travel to work in a more dignified manner. So how does this impact on education? And as I just mentioned, the floods had a devastating effect on schools and education in our province. I come from KZN, and we saw schools closed for extended periods of time because of disruption in sanitation. The buildings became uninhabitable. There was no electricity for almost 2 weeks. Access to schools were denied because the roads leading to schools were totally washed away. And this, of course, was an unusual weather pattern for us to experience. So, of course, from an education point of view, there's a direct impact on teaching and learning when it comes to these extraordinary working conditions. It takes a long time and a lot of money to actually fix the infrastructure. And right now, as it stands, a lot of schools that were damaged and infrastructure leading to these schools have not yet been attended to. At that point in time, there was a loss in teaching and learning time. And coming from an education background, I must say it's very difficult to actually catch up. So when these natural disasters happen, the unintended consequences of it is a loss in teaching and learning time. And of course, with no electricity and no networks in certain areas, going and online teaching becomes virtually impossible. So it also impacts on the food security and hunger of children in schools. And we see malnutrition and hungry children who aren't able to get to schools because the meal that they are served at schools is possibly the only meal they have for the day. So these are all the consequences I don't think we actually throw light on or focus on, because all we do is we focus on the loss in the economy, which is calculated in rands and cents, and we don't look at all of these unintended consequences on education. And now we've looked at how it is that the education sector can play a role, and how it is that NAPTOSA can feed into this. And we've looked at adapting or adopting a climate change strategy in terms of the curriculum. And we have a direct influence on the curriculum. We use this opportunity to influence the curriculum and to create opportunities in the curriculum to look at adaptation and mitigation strategies. We're also looking at creating opportunities for learners to learn about sustainable practices and environmental stewardship, and to expose learners to jobs in a clean, green economy. Because this is not talked about much in society, in communities, in schools as well. So we need to let learners explore the options out there, that there are potentials, there are job opportunities, there are career opportunities in a clean, green economy, and we need to allow them to embrace this, explore this. And as teachers, we need to expose them to these opportunities, because we know that if we don't do it in the schools, it's not going to happen anywhere else. NAPTOSA, as I said, does subscribe to the Million Climate Jobs campaign. And of course, we need to see a political will to give it muster and to urge it on. And if this happens, we will obviously see a decrease in current emissions from 547 million tons to 129 million tons. So this actually gives NAPTOSA some kind of confidence that if we put our muscle behind the strategies and the proposals in terms of this campaign, then of course we are seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. So the impact of the energy crisis has also had a devastating effect on education. It has crippled our children's right to decent quality education. And this is in the fact that we have interruptions in the school day regularly. So looking at alternative sources of electricity will not only assist us with the climate crisis, but also give us continuity in the classrooms and prevent our learners from being deprived of the technical resources that we want to expose them to. And currently, the energy crisis in the country is impacting greatly on this and taking our children forward in terms of the fourth industrial revolution. We also note that our country does have the potential for renewable energy sources through our extensive coastline, through wind power and extended hours of sunshine and the high levels of solar radiation. So this is all within the NAPTOSA policy and within our plan to use our influence wherever it may be in the Department of Basic Education with FEDUSA and as well as NEDLAC to push this kind of agenda. We also have an influence, as I said, in terms of curriculum changes that train our learners to embrace climate jobs, and also they are the future labor force. So we need to start preparing our future labor force to actually see what potential there is in a green economy. Educating our learners about the impact of climate change from the early years will also ensure environmentally responsible adults, and that is the role that educators and the education system can play. We also looked at the CETAs. We are part of the ETDP CETA, and we looked at the possibility of the CETAs and engaging with the CETAs as board members as well to to assist in financing green job related training for us to actually look at or to mitigate and adapt our current job situation and our current job scenarios so that they become green jobs. And we know that the CETAs do have funds. We just need to redirect the funds so that they reprioritize how it is they're going to do that. Employers in high emitting sectors as well must use their skill development levy to prepare their employees for future job opportunities. We can't throw our arms up in despair and look for funding if there isn't any in the current industry, and look at your contribution to the skills development levy to actually provide the training for your workers. So, as I said earlier, a major focus of NAPTOSA is to look at this as an opportunity to bring equity between men and women by training women in technical fields as well. So I just want to conclude by saying that there is a lot of potential in terms of how it is view climate justice and the climate crisis, and we need to move forward with more vigor and use the opportunities and the power and muscle that unions have to actually drive this agenda to its legitimate end. The transition to a low carbon and a climate resilient economy must be managed so that we leave no one behind, and that is what the labor force is saying. So this will require an active labor force policies and social protection measures as well. Thank you so much for listening. I hope I made it within my time allocation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Taruna. Yeah, also very inspiring to hear a union at the front line of education in this country with, I think, over 70,000 members placing the climate crisis on the agenda of the sector and, of course, taking it into the classrooms. And there's just so much that you've shared around your intervention work, which is, again, very inspiring. I'm going to just move on to Gideon du Plessis from Solidarity. Over to you, Gideon.
Thank you, Vish. Thank you very much. Good day, everybody. Time to load. So thank you, Vish. As I said here, we're looking at it from a worker point of view. I know just transition is about the quality of life for all South African citizens, but our focus is on the workers, and as a result, I will only look at the plight of the workers. But now let's look at the challenges facing workers, or basically trade unions. So the first thing is the major threat to job security. We sit with the post-COVID-19 realities of workers still haven't, a lot of the workers haven't, the salaries haven't been adjusted to what it used to be prior to COVID. There are a lot of benefits, and et cetera, that they have lost. But also on top of it, there were a lot of retrenchments and as I said, changes in conditions of employment. Then we sit with the Eskom energy crisis, together with state capture and all the failures. So load shedding is equal to job shedding. And wherever we go, in whatever sector in industry you go through retrenchment processes linked to the energy crisis. We work with Denel, with the post office, there are a lot of employees losing their jobs, and there's a lot of municipal failures also impacting on job security. Then we have high inflation, you have an investor strike, the end result is low economic growth and a 33% employment rate. And then we also deal with Industry 4.0 and artificial intelligence. So these are things that's very challenging. Then on top of it, now we need to prioritize the just transition. So we're working on a burning platform already. But if we just look at the just transition battlefield, so my colleague Marius is also on the call. He always says, we need to approach the just transition process as a Section 189 process, because in the end, it's the same thing. You know what the reason is. You need to look alternatives. You need to protect jobs. So this is basically our challenge. But when we spoke to trade unions, British trade unions and German trade unions, they both unions from those countries said, their experience was that there wasn't a just transition in their countries. A lot of jobs were lost, especially in the coal sector. And it has always been portrayed is that there will be green jobs, and that's not always the case. So now we're also we're operating in the coal sector, but in the mining sector, a gold mine worker is as important as a coal worker. So gold mining are busy shrinking. It's a sunset industry, so there's a just transition required for employees in the gold sector as well. So And then the other challenge is to link this to all the economic sectors, because as much as you may create jobs in the metal engineering sector, in the manufacturing sector, it is not possible at this stage for a worker in the coal mine who loses his or her job to get a transfer into another economic sector. Then, and it's all correct. There's such a focus on the employment of youth and women, and we fully support that. But whenever we go to these kind of forums, we always have to remind, when it's a government-initiated forum, but remember workers, how important workers are, because in the coal sector, there are 5 to 10 dependents on every coal worker, and they must be our priority, because if we neglect the workers, it will just increase the triple challenge. And then we also been confronted, and this is what Marius has spent his day on, is that the exemption applications from companies from the minimum emission standards. There's a forum created called NISA, the National Environmental Consultative Advisory Forum. So now currently what Marius is doing on behalf of Solidarity is to look at Eskom, ArcelorMittal, Haluman Limited, and then Green Oils Lubricants. They all came in and they applied for exemption. They said they're not going to meet those minimum emission standards by the 31st of March 2025. And if they are pushed to go there will either be more load shedding, because that is what Eskom is saying, and a higher level of load shedding. The other company said we're going to retrench a lot of employees. There's a lot of more detail to it, but this is one of the challenges. So the whole time you have to balance the balancing act between what is your members' interest. They join us because to protect them their jobs, but then there's also the community interest. If we look at the Kriel area of those coal mines, and by the time that all those mines would have been decommissioned, there's 80 to 90,000 people who would have died as a result of the high levels of pollution, hundreds of thousands of people that will end up with serious cases of various lung diseases. So the whole time you have to balance these various interests, and it's obviously very difficult. So the process is what happening in practice at the moment. There's the DMRE draft wrote to the Just Economic Transition Framework that basically deals with KPIs on the social side, the supply side, and demand side. Then there's that Komati repurposing project. It looks very good on paper, but I can tell you that's what it is. It looks very good on paper, but there's not much happening at the moment. But there we've seen there are 200 employees, full-time employees, jobs are secured, but then there are 400 other employees who also work there for contractors. They are the vulnerable employees. They are going to lose their jobs because they don't fall part of this formal Just Economic Transition program. Then we've got the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, a wonderful master plan, also got quite a few just transition elements in it. But as we sit there, we sit the whole time, there are service providers basically trying to position themselves to get all kinds of jobs and benefits that comes through and come out of this just transition process. Then we've got the Presidential Climate Commission. They've got this just transition framework, but it was not, they consulted on prior to them going all over the world, presenting it all over the world at all the major forums, but the consultation commenced afterwards. So that's already a problem regarding the integrity, but nevertheless, it's a very good framework. But it's then similarly in NETLAC, there's the energy work streams where a lot of issues we deal with and matters relating to just transition, but it's poorly attended, especially from Labour side, which is obviously a big concern. And then the companies, mining companies, they've got a social and labor plan. That's their license to operate. So there we can easily push for various just transition processes, because if a worker is going to lose his or her job, they have to put certain steps in place to protect the workers, to protect the community. So for us, that's the most effective way in the moment to deal with the just transition. So just in conclusion, Vish, we know the climate crisis is real. We recognize the need to reduce the carbon intensity of the economy and in the electricity sector, and we're running out of time, and we understand that. But there are serious threats for job losses, and there's a threat financial losses, because at the moment, and Barbara Creasy said it the other day at the Asian Climate Commission conference, if we are going to extend the life of the gold mines, we're putting $8.5 billion at risk, and the government doesn't have money to fund a just transition. So that's the very difficult balancing act as well at the moment for government. But we are still in the early stages of the just transition. There's a lot on paper, but not happening in practice. And I just wanted to repeat, so our challenge is to position ourselves between lives and to protect lives and livelihoods. But your tools that I've just went through it earlier today, and it's so helpful because there's a lack of information, there's a lack of education, and there's a lack of coordination at the moment between the various social partners, between the various trade union bodies. So then lastly, what is Solidarity doing? So one, we first of all, the easy route is we are a trade union, we bargain collectively. So every time we submit our demands, part of the demand is for a just transition, that whenever a company, the coal sector and manufacturing sector, motor industry, if they move towards, to a low carbon economy, then there must be a just transition. So it's built into our collective bargaining demands, it's then built into a wage agreement. We attend all the forums that we can possibly to engage to also enhance the plight of workers. But then we've got Soltech, it's our technical training college, and there they have adjusted a lot of their training to make sure that we train the youth, for these green jobs. And those are the kind of things that Solidarity is currently actively involved in. There's a lot more I can say, Vish, but I know we've only got 5 minutes. So, and this is all I will share at this stage. Thanks.
Thank you, Gideon. Again, very, very inspiring. I think you have almost 200,000 members, and it's incredible how you've positioned your union to intervene in various spaces to sort of place the climate crisis on the agenda. But I think you're also drawing our attention to the poly crisis and the squeeze on workers. And I think that's something we're also very, very sensitive to in the Climate Justice Charter movement space. And all our interventions are about tackling this poly crisis. So yes, there's a lot to share and there's a lot to do together. You're in a very pro-worker space, and I know you know that. Okay, we've had apologies from the COSATU representatives. They really, really wanted to be here. But a political commission apparently is sitting, and some of them have been roped into it, both Lebogang and Tango, who wanted to be here today. But nonetheless, we're going to move on to SAFTU, and we'd like to call upon our comrade Trevor Shaku, if he's here. Trevor?
Yes, I'm here. I joined through the link of our president. So I appear as Ruth. Thank you very much. Regarding the topic, obviously there's a lot to cover, and I'll try as much to cover many areas, but I'll go to the major areas of concerns for us. So maybe the preamble should be that the South African Federation of Trade Unions also recognizes the climate catastrophe that is imminent if our economy and our way of consumption continue on the trajectory of fossil fuel intensive economy. And in that instance, there's a need for us to be able to transition to renewable energy sources. And on the base of that, there is, I think, a broad consensus throughout the left movement in particular, and the trade union movement. Of course, there is a problem, which is, and I will expound on it when I deal with the challenges, which is brought by fears of job losses and what would happen to the economies of those communities who rely on coal value chain or fossil fuel value chains. So, and I think the previous speaker also mentioned this particular challenge. So there is that. There's broad consensus, but there are fears of job losses and the destruction of the communities, of the economies of those communities who rely on this. So this is the first point I have to make. The second point which I have to make is on the question of because there's broad consensus. So a bigger chunk of our concerns lies with the political economy of the just transition itself, just energy transition itself. And there are many things which actually I would like to point us to, which are of serious concern. And as the Federation, we have registered our opposition to it in the past. The first area, which is an overarching view of the Federation, is that we are anti-privatization. And we think that there is an attempt to privatize energy provision in this country. And this process would have started a while ago, but it is even accelerated with this particular transition. And we want to register our opposition to it. But where do we take the facts that, and why do we say that we think that privatization is going to be the main mode of method of political economy in this just energy transition? Is because of what would have been published, first by the Presidential Climate Commission in the country, but also the Inter-Presidential Climate Commission, which would have published a very detailed reports last year, one of which section was dealing with financing. And they would have proposed a number of measures, methods on how they're going to raise finance, which would then enable us as a society globally to be able to transition. And when you narrow that to South Africa, the Presidential Climate Commission released a framework for just transition last year, I think in June 2022. And later, I think in November, they released the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, the JEDIP. So in all of these documents, in the framework for just transition from June, they have a shorter section that deals with finance. And in the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, they deal with this financing. And for us, the methods of how we're going to transition, we're going to finance the transition, is also determinant of the ownership structure, which will champion that particular transition. Now, the first method that I want to deal with, and this you can find it in the section on financing in the JEDIP. First of all, they paint a gloomy picture on public finances. They refer to the so-called debt to GDP ratios, which are high according to them. They're also referring to the so-called budget deficits and budget deficits as a share of the GDP again. They refer to the fact that the country's fiscal is bloated and all of that. This so-called fiscal unsustainability and fiscal risks, they use that particular premise to build an argument for them to be able to go outside to seek funds, to go to the private sector to seek funds. And they've done so. Part of the JEDIP was actually one of those things which spelled out the privatization intentions of the just energy transition as envisioned by our government, including, of course, the Presidential Climate Commission. I can say this now with more conviction because they released on the 15th a report wherein it contained their recommendations, and some of those recommendations actually are in sync with or are syncing with the proposals which are actually proposed in the JEDIP. So this is the second point. So for instance, in the JEDIP, they would have said that the ESCOM resolution 3, I think, resolution 3 says that ESCOM there has to be unbundling, and the government ought to play a role only of creating an enabling environment, and of course creating an enabling environment for who? For the private sector, because for them, the private sector is the one that would only have to play that particular role. And how will this government then play that particular role of creating an enabling environment? Now, they propose certain funding and financing methods, which indeed, if you look at them, their implications is that indeed they're creating such an enabling environment. An enabling environment for the private sector to do what? That's the question that should fall. But the answer is that it is an enabling environment for the private sector to come in and first of all, be able to reap profits and alleviate a lot of risks which are involved, of course, in the course of any operating business enterprise. Now, they propose the following. They propose blended financing. They propose government guarantees. And of course, we've seen and learned through the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program that the introduction of the IPPs also add another element of creating an enabling environment. And that particular element is the question of demand guarantees. And let me just a little bit explain these implications. The implications of the things I've just mentioned, these elements I've just mentioned. Blended financing, of course, according to them, the World Bank and the OECD, and generally amongst bourgeois economists, is where, for instance, funds from development finance institutions and funds from government come in and de-risk the private investments of certain private companies. So, and how mostly it is implemented, it is through the public-private partnership models, where the state and the developmental institutions then take the risks for that particular company and the implementing company. And the private sector's investments there merely are cushioned by the investments of those coming either as grants from developmental institutions, finance institutions, or from government. So there's a form of blended financing they're proposing, that government must underwrite the risk of their investment so that they can reap profits. And for quite some time, we've correctly characterized this as the socialization of the risks and the privatization of profits. The second element, which achieves the same method of privatizing profits and socializing risks, is that they are proposing government guarantees. And we already see with the IPPs, those types of the government guarantees on the IPPs and all of that. One of those is that if you check at the medium-term budget policy statement of government in October 2022, you will see on the contingent liabilities that what is outlined, already government is guaranteed 179 billion rands to the IPPs, which are existing. By the way, those IPPs are not even adding a lot of electricity to the grid. They're only supplying, I think, less than 7 gigawatts. Now, and these are the people who actually make noise anytime government has to bail out ESCOM. But they're not looking at the underwriting of the very private producers who, in fact, are just reaping profits at the expense of the public. The third element, which I think is also necessary for us to highlight because it's a serious concern, is the question of the demand guarantees. We are told by economic textbooks that entrepreneurship, capitalism, or capitalists and capitalist enterprises are about risk-taking. But what actually happens here is that the methods I've mentioned, and with the one I'm going to explain in a moment, the demand guarantees, is that these people are actually running away from taking those particular risks. They want government to de-risk their investment. They want government to alleviate all the risks of their investments. And actually for us, this provides no justification for why they should champion the just energy transition path. We think that the just energy transition path should be a public pathway, should be championed by the state with its public entity. Of course, it needs to be fixed. We'll deal with that in a moment. The demand guarantees, just in short, guarantees these IPPs and those private players will come in the process of the market. They guarantee them of the market because they have these login contracts wherein government will have to procure that electricity. Whether there is demand in the by consumers or not, government has to get into contracts which lock it in the procurement of those particular electricity. So in other words, they continue to generate not just revenue, but profits because government would have guaranteed that. Secondly, they want government, of course, to give them the market. And how do we even see this unfolding, even in tangible form? It is unfolding through the amendment bill, which is proposed for the amendment of the Electricity Regulation Act. The Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill, which currently is to be discussed and I think approved in Parliament, and I think the cabinet would have signed off on it. It just has to be passed in Parliament. From section 30, and I think to 36 or 37, somewhere there, they are actually there making the realization of these demand guarantees where they are assuring and creating this an enabling environment. First of all, liberalizing the generation market, but secondly, also creating a central purchasing agency, which of course will buy electricity from these people. And in that context, it achieves two things. One, it creates the market for the independent power producers, but at the same time, it creates a position where it creates the market in the first instance, and in the second instance, it creates a situation wherein these independent power producers introduction will go for the liberalization of the energy generation division. And that, of course, leads to further unbundling of ESCOM. The ESCOM's presentations to the PCC, especially the labor consultation, they presented a plan which showed that at the end of this process, where they would have met their national determined contributions by 2050, at the end of that process, ESCOM would have been unbundled in the generation division up to 66.66%, that is the 2/3. And in the distribution, it would have been unbundled up to 75%. Now, all of this is geared, as I've said, towards privatization. Now, we do not think, and this is towards conclusion, comrades, what this creates is that we are afraid of two things. The tendency of capitalism is to concentrate and centralize. That is the mode of its accumulation. And currently we are being convinced that no, the introduction of these IPPs will make electricity be cheaper because it will create competition. There will be many players in that market who are competing, and therefore it will drive down the price of electricity. But we do not think this is going to be correct in the long term and even in the short term. In the short term, already they have come to renegotiate their contracts and have said that the cost of the input cost of assembling production and generation have increased compared to the time when they were bidding. And as a result, they are going to have to demand increases on the amount of electricity they sell to ESCOM by about 12% on a yearly basis for the next 5 years. Now, that means, I think, 60% in the course of 5 years. And this, of course, will be factored into the tariffs of electricity, which is sold to consumers. So this is not going to make, even in the immediate terms, it's not going to make electricity cheaper. But secondly, the question of centralization will come into play, because as time goes on, in order for them to be able to accumulate, unless there will be regulatory frameworks which are introduced to stop them from gobbling one another and centralizing, then they are going to centralize. And we know, all of us, that where monopoly and oligopoly exist, there is imperfect competition. And as a result, these people become price makers and not price takers. So even in the long term, you have a problem where electricity prices are going to still go high. And it will be even a scary situation, because you'll be dealing with private monopolies, not public monopoly, as in the case of ESCOM. The third element to this is that the lock-in contracts themselves are making the South Africans not to enjoy that very competition that we may achieve in the immediate term, because you are locked in certain forms of prices, and in order for you to be able to pay them this much, Eskom is corporatized. That means it has to live on its balance sheet. So a lot of that money would have to be taken through tariffs and not through grants from and grants from the government. So those are the three elements which we think will be resultant out of this particular process of privatization, which will then deepen the next element I wanted to talk about, the energy poverty. The access, according to the Statistics South Africa, I think the household survey would have shown that 89% of households are connected to the grid, which means about 10% are not. But for us, the question of access is not, the question of energy poverty does not only speak to access, but also speaks to the question of affordability. We already have 75% of the workforce in the country earning less than 5,800, which means it's very difficult for them to actually afford this. But more importantly, they try by all means to transcend this problem by trying to create energy mix in their households, by procuring paraffin, using wood. Some of these things are even dangerous for their health. So I know I've taken a lot of time, Comrade Chair, but this is not all that I wanted to say, but this is the core concerns that the South African Federation of Trade Unions is raising and concerned about. But just one last thing, the question of the foreign debt. So the loans which are being taken are going to present us with problems in the future because of two things. The first one is that the problems which were faced by the Eurozone countries, the problem of sovereign debt, we may face it in the future, especially if we accumulate more debt that is denominated in foreign currencies. But secondly, the question of just the volatility in the forex market, which leads to the devaluation of the rand, itself makes this particular debt that is denominated in foreign currencies to increase. So those are the concerns, and thank you very much for your indulgence.
Thank you so much, Comrade Trevor. And it's again heartening to note that SAFTU is hammering at the sort of problematic elements of the Just Energy Transition Partnership, but also you are pushing back against the unjust transition in Eskom. So, comrades, we have an opportunity to bring in a few of the other voices and participants in our assembly today. It's clear that workers are getting hit from the kind of faltering economy coming out of the COVID pandemic. Workers are getting hit in the context of the rolling blackouts and load shedding, and of course, the unjust transition that's unfolding. We have comrades here all the way from Liberia. We have comrades from Zambia. We have comrades from Zimbabwe. We have comrades from other unions, from NACTU and Mawusa. We have comrades from Haitu. We have comrades from SAMU. We have comrades from a COSATU local in the Groblershoop. We have comrades from Zambia, Zufau, Satawu in Swane. We have Mawusa. We have Denosa. We have Saksakwu. We have LCMF and COSATU local Alex. AMKU we have with us. We have Satawu. So comrades, let's just open it up and take 3 or 4 other voices present in our assembly tonight to talk about the challenges facing workers and trade unions and how this relates to the just transition. If we can just have some brief inputs, comrades. Yes, Comrade Kamaholo Komotse, your hand is up. Please go ahead and please keep it short so we can take in other comrades. After you, Comrade Mabu. Comrade Komotso, go ahead. Charles, have you been able to enable that? Okay, Comrade Mabu, can you go ahead?
Thanks, Prof. Good evening, comrades. I would like to agree with Comrade, it's Comrade Shakune, the one that just spoke now in terms of the Just Transition Investment Plan, to say that as workers, the main concern that you are having here is that, for starters, I'm from the transport sector, but you see that the interest around that investment plan seems to be only on the energy sector. That is the first concern that we are having. The second one is that it seems like the whole thing is pushing really the interest of your private investors. Currently, from the rail sector, there's a policy or a white paper that has been passed on that is called the National Rail Policy. And when you go through that document, it only caters for the need of your private sector. There's nothing there about workers. There's nothing there even about communities and all that. Is just big people, big businesses that are going to be brought into the sector that then are going to be the ones that can invest, and at the end of the day they'll make a profit there. There's nothing that addresses the workers to say if this private sector comes into the rail system, what is then going to happen to the workforce that is there already. And another thing, we can't then come and say the Presidential Climate Commission, the documents that they've been presenting and all that, we can't then be comfortable as the workers and say that they are catering for us as workers or even the communities, because the last Presidential Climate Commission that we have attended, I think I did share the documents with you, Prof. When we were there, it was not only us as the workers or the labor movement that was had concerns, even the communities that was there. They said that you're talking about localization, making sure that all these investment plan and whatever that we are coming up with is going to benefit the community, but there is still the red tape that is there. So hence we are saying that as much as they can come and say they are going to create jobs and all that, there's nothing like that. That seems, or this Presidential Climate Commission and their document seems to be presenting. It seems like the poor of the poor are going to remain the poor, and only the rich people are the ones that are going to benefit from them. So that is where then we are sitting, or I'm sitting as a worker leader and as a worker as well, to say, if ever we're taken through to say, workers, this is where we are saying, what allow us to come in and put and give you guys our inputs and concerns. I know that COSATU has already presented the concerns that they got from us through SATAW and all that. But then the question then remains to say, are they going to implement all those things? Are they going to make sure that each and every worker, each and every member of the community is taken through? Now that remains to be seen. And as workers, I don't think we can then sit back and say we are going to wait for the very same government to make decisions for us, because we definitely know that they don't have our interest at heart. Thank you, Prof. I think I took I was within the time. Thank you.
No, it was great. But Comrade Mabu is underlining that this is becoming a private sector-led transition, like everybody else, and it's moving in an unjust direction. I must also say and apologize, we were going to have Comrade Zico Tamela from SATAW, and Comrade Mabu and I, behind the scenes, were trying to get a hold of him. But yeah, in his place, actually, there's Comrade Kamachelo. Comrade Kamachelo, yes, we'll give you your 5 minutes. Please speak. Are you there, Comrade Kamachelo?
Hi. Thanks.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. No, I'll just jump right into what was meant to be the perspective. Obviously, Comrade Zico couldn't attend, so he asked me to jump in quickly to his place. So I'll keep it as brief as possible. So basically echoing I'll just start with an introduction. I'm from the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union, like my comrade Mabu just spoke. It's both the transport sector, but we also organize in cleaning and private security. So we organize in the transport sector, we organize in maritime and road freight, aviation, bus passenger and rail freight and passenger rail as well. And just jumping straight into the issues, I think one of the challenges that we are currently facing as a union, it really goes back to the issue that Comrade Mabu was speaking about, concerning specifically the release of the white paper on rail national policy. It was released, I believe, in last year. It was It came 5 years after an initial policy as well, released in 2017. And that basically speaks to the privatization of rail. And one of the issues that we've often been at pains to complain about is the fact that, you know, there was a lack of consultation on the part of the state. We felt that labor was sidelined, and we felt that even on occasions where there would be such consultations, that it was really a tick box exercise, because the final decisions had already been taken, and labor had obviously been sidelined from those key decision-making forums. So the currently going through a privatization process in rail, in particular, PRASA and Transnet. Obviously this is a neoliberal ploy, which is meant to benefit the private sector and disadvantage labor, as well as communities that support that sector, that is supported by that sector. So going into the concerns, obviously, as mentioned by other comrades, job losses is definitely something that often comes up with engagement with workers. And in fact, the ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation, did a research, I believe it was in the 90s, about how the privatization of rail in Latin American countries absolutely devastated those communities, and to the extent that, yeah, even up till now, there are ghost towns in those communities, which shows that the narrative that states that the private sector will bring heaven and earth on these sorts of sectors is incorrect. So there's also the issue of I believe they call it Section 197. Where now you have a transfer of, I believe it's contracts. So in the instance of the privatization of an SOE, you'd have workers transferred from the control of the state, the main employer, to now a private sector partner. So the concern is, will working conditions change? Will they get worse? How will they be? And obviously, will workers be retrenched? Insofar as our approach is concerned, I just quickly want to pull up our submission that we made to the COSATU 14th National Congress, speaking on this, and I'll just read directly from it, just so that comrades can get the type of approach that we're taking. So we feel that the current bourgeois green economy energy strategy will not lead us to a low carbon society. We feel that the process towards a just transition is often utopian and takes out of sight material productive relations that are obviously extractivist in nature. We feel that government policies creating conditions for the private sector to thrive off of the ecological crisis, and believe that the shift from road freight to rail freight on one hand, and from private to public transportation on the other hand, on its own, is unrealistic without an implementable integrated public transport and intermodal system. So therefore, we felt that there should be a strong exploration of other forms of green energy, such as hydrogen, of course, the blue economy exploration, obviously solar and wind power, within the context of an eco-socialist perspective. We feel that government should increase spending on infrastructural and spatial development to foster the transition from road to rail freight, which is essentially their perspective, and from private to public transportation. And key to this is a publicly owned transportation system, rather than a private sector owned and controlled transportation system. And this should be achieved through the formulation of coherent and implementation of practical policies focusing on an integrated public transport system on the one hand, and an intermodal freight transport system on the other. We felt that organized labor should have its own widely accepted approach of the concept of a just transition, as opposed to following a narrative that is controlled by the bourgeoisie, the private sector, and that we as labor, as well as like-minded civil society groups, should play a more active role in initiating, shaping, and influencing, as well as implementing, which is key, the word implementing social policy discourse to practically advance the principle of worker control. So yes, that's the presentation. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I'm load shedded here, so you're not going to see me. So thank you for that presentation. Comrades, tonight is the kickoff of deepening this engagement. And there's definitely lots more to share and hear about. But because of time, I'm going to transition into our next panel, which will share what we are busy with as the Climate Justice Charter movement and how we want to work with labor. Comrades from SATAU and other unions, I'm sure you're going to enjoy the presentation after that on our eco-mobility and clean energy public transport policy. It's a draft, and we're putting it into the public arena tonight, and we'll be looking forward to all unions, particularly SATAU, inputting into it so we can finalize it together. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Stacey Hope Bailey to chair us in the next session. Stacey, are you here?
Hi, Vish. Yes, I'm here. I'm not going to turn on my camera because I also have no light, so you won't see anything if it was on. And in fact, it's so great to hear all of this robust thinking and how many things align with the different opinions that we've been able to hear from different CJC members. There's definitely a shared vision coming together, and it's very exciting. And in fact, I'm handing straight back to Vish for the first input in terms of responding from the CJC and the thinking that's been developing there, to tell us a bit about the CJC in general and the policies that are being developed.
Yeah, thank you, Stacey, and I'm not going to take too long. So comrades, the Climate Justice Charter is the first climate justice charter in the world. It comes out of almost 6 years of campaigning against the drought. We developed it in a very bottom-up way, engaging with constituencies, unions, faith-based communities, social justice organizations, youth and children, academics. Parliament, and we've been twice to Parliament, has not adopted the Climate Justice Charter, although there's provision in our Constitution, Section 234, for it to be adopted. Nonetheless, for us, the Charter is a plurivision. Now, what do we mean by a plurivision? It means that we want to address the legacies of apartheid. We want to address the present polycrises. And of course, we want to fight for a livable, just, and democratic future. So this means, comrades, we are not about typical elite environmentalism. Front and center, we are about climate justice. We are about tackling the inequalities in our society. We are about tackling the unemployment. We are about tackling the exclusion in our society and the suffering of the many. So this is what the Climate Justice Charter is all about. This is what the Climate Justice Charter movement is all about. We have started a process of translating the Charter into policies. We've recognized, like our union comrades, there's an unjust transition unfolding in the country. And the only way for us to get ahead of this problem is if we start developing our own strategic initiative, our own policy agenda, our own concrete answers vis-a-vis the deep just transition. So we kicked off our first policy, which is a rights of nature and natural climate solutions policy on Earth Day. And I must underline, all these policies are being developed in working groups led mainly by young people. They are writing these documents. They are doing the literature searches. They are doing the policy scans. And these are the young people that have a lot more to lose than all of us. So our first policy landed, and it's opening up a debate about how we ensure our ecosystems are kept resilient, because our ecosystems absorb carbon. whether it's our oceans, whether it's our forests, whether it's our trees and shrubs, they absorb carbon, and they're very, very important. And hence we need to have a more transformative approach to conservation. Our second policy, which we're launching tonight, you'll hear more about it, on eco-mobility and clean energy public transport. Again, it's a draft policy, and we're trying to make some serious propositions to society around how we decarbonize, next to energy, one of the biggest polluting sectors in the South African economy, without compromising our workers in this country. We're also busy with the policy on food sovereignty. Comrades, we are going to have another big drought. The drought that hit our food system very hard. It actually collapsed. The next drought is probably going to be a 10-year drought. So we really now have to put into place that next food system. And we've been working on food sovereignty now for almost 8 years. And we are going to be presenting a food sovereignty policy for the country for debate and engagement. We are working on a water commons policy for the country. Water is going to be a very, very big challenge in this country. Already there are shortages because of inequality, etc. With climate Hi, I'm back, I think. Yeah. So comrades, in short, there's a whole series of policies that we are developing. We'll be launching some of our policies on Youth Day on June 16th. And we'll be launching a book on that day as well, titled People's and Workers' Climate Justice Charter Futures. We'll be launching policies in July, together with informal traders, unemployed people's movements. We'll be launching policies on Women's Day as well. I'm going to pause there, and just to say that we want to work with Labour on these policies. We want your input. And again, these are weapons in our struggle to shift the debate and to take back the initiative for a just transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vish, for that background. Great. There I see Awanda has turned his camera on. So the first presentation, I won't waste any more. I won't take any of your time introducing it, because I'm sure he will speak, give some introduction. Will be by Awanda, and he'll be talking about the climate justice deal. Go ahead, Awanda.
Thank you, Stacey. Just sharing my screen. So today I'm speaking about the climate justice deal, which is one of our umbrella campaigns to accelerate and deepen the just transition. I know also we're kind of time sensitive, so I'll do my best to give a kind of comprehensive overview of what this document is dealing with and what it's trying to fundamentally explain or expand on with regards to taking what the charter provides as a foundation and giving it macroeconomic policy form. And with regards to the contents of the document, we begin with a look at the climate science and what that means for South Africa and other climate injustices within the region and developing countries such as ours, the failed macroeconomic policies, neoliberal macroeconomic policies, and the poly-crisis of social ecological reproduction in South Africa, what those outcomes have been of those policies, and how the climate crisis exacerbates that. And then we look towards an eco and life-centric macroeconomics to accelerate the deep just transition, the kind of thinking and breaks from mainstream economic thinking, which the climate justice thinking around being beyond in terms of building something else more holistic, more expansive from some of these other perspectives, a climate justice deal for South Africa and democratic systemic reforms, speaking towards the policy thrusts and the policy prescriptions which the climate justice deal puts forward. So those are also some of the other policies which Vish was speaking about, and how some of those are housed within this greater structure of what the climate justice deal puts forward as a macroeconomic policy. Just going over briefly what those are, and then also challenges to accelerate and deepen the just transition. So with regards to the first section, science, looking at the science that's informed by the IPCC, such as the 6 assessment reports, looking at what the science confirms with regards to the current rates of heating, us having already gone over 1.1 degrees and well on our way towards going past 1.5 degrees. And also what the report says with regards to the indications of continued warming, things that the report highlights with the need for urgent and ambitious action so that we can limit heating at 1.5 degrees, as previous IPCC reports since 2018 have been stating is required, not just the 2 degrees, which a lot of countries and mainstream global discussions around climate mitigation have tended to sometimes veer towards, and that emphasizing the urgency of what these reports and what the science says with regards to the need for rapid and deep reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And beyond that, also the need for adaptation measures to address some of the unavoidable impacts which have already been locked in with our current levels of heating, and which will be locked in at 1.5 degrees levels of heating. Also beyond this, with regards to the science, speaking with regards to some of the other climate impacts, future climate risks that we'll face as a developing country in our region, such as droughts, extreme rainfall events, floods, storms, and things of that nature, rising sea levels, and how that will impact us, particularly as a country with a vast area of coastal region, particularly for communities in low-lying coastal areas, the impacts of these changing weather patterns on agriculture and food systems. What will that mean for access to water resources, as we see that there are still parts of our country, large parts of the country, without water, and also what these climate impacts will mean in terms of exacerbating existing health challenges, and what that looks like with regards to the spread of infectious diseases and other heat-related illnesses. But also with regards to these long-term impacts, as part of the document, also that there are to leapfrog traditional carbon-intensive pathways and to adapt clean energy technologies and sustainably transformative practices. So the rest of the document, in a sense, is an exercise in that with regards to what some of those other, what this is, what the climate justice deal presents as an opportunity towards that transformative approach. It's also important to note in this part, we also look at the carbon inequality, particularly within the country. South Africa as the highest emitter on the continent with 26% of emissions, what that means, what that looks like across sectors, and also what that looks like within our country with regards to how our country's income and wealth inequality also plays out with regards to emissions and consumption. Then going into failed neoliberal macroeconomic policy and the polycrisis of social ecological reproduction, looking at what the state of neoliberal policies has constructed with regards to our state structure, the characteristics of that, the internationalized aspects of it, the primacy of monetary policy, the way in which monetary policy has been put as at the forefront to the extent that things such as employment creation has become secondary, dismantling self-sufficiency in state structures throughout the era of neoliberal implementation, and the culture of capitalist enrichment, which is also meshed in with corruption that we see today. Some of the other outcomes that we touch on in this part of the document with regards to our high levels of inequality, levels of persistent poverty and unemployment that our country faces, and the ways in which The introduction of neoliberal policies has promoted these things, for example, with regards to inequality, by promoting deregulation and privatization, which has benefited the wealthy at the expense of the poor, and with regards to poverty and unemployment, the promotion of flexible labor markets and the way in which they've led to casualization and wage stagnation and job insecurity. In addition to this, limited investments in social services, that has meant for a country which is in dire need of social services such as healthcare, education, and housing, and how these policies, these neoliberal policies, have contributed to the limitation of investment in these areas, with public services being cut back in favor of privatization. In addition to this, other outcomes of these policies have been levels of debt and dependence on forest investments. We go into that, and the document also touches on what this dependency on foreign investment has led to with regards to our loss in our sovereignty and the control which we've had over our economy and decisions we could make in the economy to intervene in facing as a country. All of this connects with the poly-crisis of social ecological reproduction, looking at the various interrelated crises that are affecting both human and non-human life as in the natural environment, which they depend on. Some of our policies go into further depth in explicating some of these issues, and also recognizing the way in which social ecological systems are interconnected. So in this part of the document, we're tying and showing how these neoliberal policies and the outcomes have only exacerbated and contributed to the poly-crisis of socio-ecological reproduction, worsening unemployment and precarization, the rolling blackouts and load shedding we're currently suffering from, the worsening hunger, which was seen starkly during the time of the COVID lockdowns, water inequality and the water stress currently faced by a lot of communities, the crisis in our healthcare system, where we saw the excess deaths during the COVID-19 pandemic, showing some of the gaps in our system, and also how this has spread to the realm of the household, in communities, the violence that we see against women and children, and the way in which it's endemic in our country. Also touches on the carbon lock-ins and the ways in which carbon lock-ins worsen the poly-crisis by reinforcing the dominance of fossil fuels in our energy system, but also how they make it more difficult for us to transition to alternative energy systems and alternative sustainable practices and structures within our society. The ways in which carbon lock-ins perpetuates and impact environmental problems that we're already facing, increasing biodiversity loss, and the way in which it also contributes to social and economic inequalities which have been created by the current system which we live in. And then the next section is going towards eco and life-centric macroeconomics to accelerate the deep just transition, where we go into greater detail with regards to how the climate justice deal is moving away from neoclassical economic orthodoxy, as the Climate Justice Charter calls for a life-centered approach to economics, mainstream economics being the hindrance that we need to go beyond, and in particular, the focus on economic growth. So going to a deep dive, really interrogating what the limitations of growth-centered macroeconomics are and how they align with the crisis, how it contributes to environmental degradation, the ways in which it contributes to social inequality, the resource constraints which we're faced, which growth-centered thinking doesn't take into account, economic instability, the way in which growth-centered thinking and growth-centered approaches to the economy have accompanied or are accompanied by these cycles of instability, and also the ways in which we need to address these limitations by going beyond and seeking and taking into account alternative economic state of affairs, social equity, and environmental protection over just GDP growth. So even the concept of development in and of itself must be interrogated, what that means. It must be rethought of anew, and that's what this document puts forward, and that's what it seeks to give a framework for. Also look at some of the other examples of these alternative models, aspects of them which are productive and beneficial for our perspective and our context within South Africa, take into account some of our, wider macroeconomic challenges, and also other measurements of ways in which we can account for and measure how our economy is functioning in a way in which we have redefined as more beneficial towards meeting the goals of a life-centered and life-affirming approach. So there's also some examples that we go through in this part. But we also take into account other framings of what is required with regards to ways in which we measure progress and ways in which we measure success in this new climate justice deal macroeconomic framework. Take into account the natural commons and extinction rates as things that must be taken into account when measuring the performance of an economy. Ecological limits, boundaries, and cycles also need to be taken into account, and we give ways in which that can be done. And then also the introduction of a life index or life indices for helping us to measure the quality of human life, happiness and well-being within an economy, but also the general state of natural commons and how that is intertwined with all these other aspects of quality of human life and well-being. And then we get into key democratic systemic reforms, the policy thrusts or the policy prescriptions, which this document puts forward, and which will also being done in parallel with this document as policies which give life and shape to this structure, this framework of the climate justice deal. So beginning with public and common services, this is a policy, and these are policy prescriptions which tackle fundamentally with the problem of inequality, addressing inequality in the country directly. So within this, we give the figures and the structure of how they can be implemented, programs such as the Universal Basic Income Grant, and what that looks like in South Africa, the percentages in terms of amounts of reduction within poverty across various levels, and then the democratic public utilities, which will have a direct impact on poverty and inequality in our country. So we're looking at healthcare, education, internet, and transportation, ways in which we expand that to make them universally available to the public, and the ways in which that would impact poverty and inequality reduction. And then also the introduction of a which will frontline needs for communities that have faced certain climate impacts, the emergency and immediate needs, for example, when we saw with the extreme rainfall events last year in KZN, being able to address the myriad of climate impacts that we'll be facing in a heating world, given the impacts that are already locked in with the current heating we're at. Next, we have climate jobs, talking about a climate jobs guarantee, expanding on all the range of different climate jobs that come out of all the policies that we're putting forward, what they look like and how they work together to form a comprehensive structure of climate jobs, the ways in which they may be phased in with regards to our immediate goals and needs for the climate justice deal within the next 5, 10 to 20 years, what that will look like, the new state institutions, quasi-state institutions that would have to be implemented in the process of democratic planning and implementation of these jobs, the introduction of national emergency management agencies, what that will look like and how they will deal with national emergencies, the cultural and arts dynamic with regards to expanding on the understanding of what climate jobs are and what other forms of low carbon work are, and where they'll fit in and how they help in pushing through the goals of a climate justice deal. Local and regional climate jobs programs, so also targeting specifically at the local, municipal, and regional level, the forms of jobs which are required. So in particular, here we're looking at jobs that are required for transformative regeneration of ecosystems. So there'll be different needs at different areas because they may align with different biospheres. Coastal regions will be different towards semi-arid and desert regions compared to savanna regions and forest areas. So there's a lot of kind of jobs that will come out of the specific needs and demands of the ecological rehabilitation work that will have to be done across these different areas. So also giving expansion into that, and then also Climate Works program for youth and unemployed peoples under the age of 25. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that I am keeping with time. Looking at rapid phasing out of fossil fuels for socially and community-owned renewable energy, new structures with regards to the social potential of renewable energy, with regards to energy democracy, what that would look like infrastructurally, the different forms of grids that can be put in place, and the different forms of energy that we can draw on that is renewable, but also enhances the principles of democracy, outlining the different social ownership models that would also work with the implementation of these new energy structures, spaces for public participation, what that would look like, the decentralization of grids, what that will mean, and also the role of energy cooperatives in public ownership, zero waste and eco-centric manufacturing policy, also sustainable increases in investments to low carbon infrastructure, the conversion and repurposing of industries, identifying key industries which will be needed for eco-manufacturing, and also the useful technologies that will require moving forward. Environmental technologies being some of these to help address us with water scarcity and providing reliable water and sanitation as an example. And also in addition to this, also the ways in which they can help us with regards to other concerns such as leak detection technologies for saving water, the review of dams and irrigation systems, among other things. Eco-housing and transition towns is another aspect of this, fundamentally expanding on what the housing crisis means, how eco-housing and new building materials can help in addressing this, addressing apartheid spatial planning, approaches towards centralized and decentralized urban planning for eco-communities, what they will look like, and the differences between where they would be beneficial across different parts of the country, and then also a model of what transition towns would look like. With regards to finance, looking at what the state has put forward with regards to its investment plan, juxtaposing this with some of the requirements and context of our current economic or fiscal structure or context, particularly looking at the debt of ESCOM, the promises made within the Paris Climate Agreement for developing nations towards just transition for countries such as ours, monetary policy, looking at fiscal policy with regards to what we can do with stimulus spending for climate justice deal programs, foreign exchange reserves, looking at how much we have with regards to being able to use for that stimulus, and then also taking into account the entire restructuring of the balance sheet of our country, looking at our total assets, the gross national debt, and also other important financial institutions such as the Public Investment Corporation, what they have, what they can contribute with regards to spending for climate justice deal program, unemployment insurance fund, development bank, taxes also is another means of being able to achieve this, and also other prescribed asset requirements for public and private pension funds in how they can contribute to investing in the deep just transition and a climate justice deal. Finally, democratic planning and people-driven climate justice state, looking at the institutions and processes that would have to be put in place to help make sure that the climate justice deal is applicable and something that can be implemented from below, but also at a national level. So we're looking at the climate justice deal as a response to institutional crisis. What does that mean? How does this framework of institutional crisis we see in planning within our country? Traditions of democratic planning around the world are also brought into consideration, and the ways in which they can be put into this African context. Climate emergency democratic planning councils to help coordinate across and outside the state, looking at the ways in which we would coordinate existing institutions, such as our financial institutions like the Development Bank and other institutions that I mentioned in the finance sections, the way in which we would help them work together to implement these programs, structures of regional and national CJ deal planning councils, outlining what those will look like and how they work together in tandem, and then also other institutions which would have to be created to help facilitate the implementation of a climate justice deal. So a climate justice deal act in Parliament, which would help facilitate the creation of those institutions, the reformatting of the Presidential Climate Commission into something more democratic and less closed off in terms of public accountability and public transparency of its processes, and repurposing other government structures such as NEDLAC and National Intergovernmental Planning Institutions into a National Intergovernmental Societal Planning Council. I will stop there for time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Awande. And it's good to call it an umbrella campaign. Indeed, it is a very broad umbrella, and there are so many different issues to bring together, which thank you very much. It's been a great overview of many, many topics and many things, a large number of which came up in the presentations from the trade unionists earlier on. I'll hand over to Charles now, who will give a very practical presentation about some of the tools that have been developed by the CJC and its different member organizations up to this point.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Over the years, Ketas, we have developed several tools to deepen and accelerate the just transition. We have developed several activist tools and activist guides to empower activists in just transition work. One of the tools that we have developed is the People's Planning Tool for a Deep Just Transition. It's an activist guide that you can find on our website, so the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign website. You can also find it on the Climate Justice Charter Movement webpage. So the purpose of this guide is to provide an introductory tool to ensure the democratization of just transition planning. If you look at the climate change bill, which is supposed to be the primary legislation in terms of planning approaches and responses to the climate crisis, what it advances is a top-down form of planning, one that is technocratic and is devoid of the tacit knowledge and people's lived experiences. So one of the purposes of this particular guide is to ensure that we empower activists with democratization of just transition planning, to also enable activists to use the Climate Justice Charter to develop deep just transition plans in their communities, deep just transition plans in their workplaces, as well as in their sectors as well, and strategies for socio-ecological systems, as well as building capacity and advancing the processes of the deep just transition. The purpose of the guide is also to lay the basis to develop a suite of complementary tools, such as the climate shock tool that we are currently working on, and the decarbonization tool that we are also developing. So the guide has 7 modules, the first one being the introduction, the second one dealing, of course, with the climate crisis, and making sure that the language of the climate crisis is accessible to all. One of the things we always aim to do in our guide is to ensure that the guide is accessible to everyone, because sometimes the technical jargon around the climate crisis, the socio-ecological crisis, can sort of disadvantage a lot of people. So one of the things we try to do is to make climate science accessible to everyone. Hence, the guide is doing just that. Then the third module deals with the Climate Justice Charter, the visions of the Charter. It explains the plurivision that Vish spoke about at the beginning, dealing with our historical context, dealing with the challenges that we have now, as well as building a livable future for human and non-human life. It defines the deep just transition, because the just transition is being used everywhere, but it defines what we mean by a deep just transition, what goes into that. The fifth module advances the deep just transition through democratic planning. Module 6 deals with climate visioning, people's planning and deep just transition activism, like I said, in communities and workplaces, in different sectors, and of course in local government, because local government is at the forefront of dealing with the climate crisis. And unless we have a local government that is prepared to deal with climate shocks, a lot of people are going to be exposed to many climate shocks, and we will not have a government in place to deal with those kinds of things. So the guide advances building a climate emergency state, a democratic climate emergency state that can deal with climate shocks, that can deal with adaptation, that can also develop systems regeneration. The seventh module deals with accelerating the deep just transition in communities, in sectors, and in local governments. Another tool that we have developed over the years is the Let's Feed Ourselves Through Food Sovereignty Activist Guide. This activist guide is made up of different case studies. It shows how different people in different communities, from the rural areas of Jekezi to the Cape Flats, to Kabeja, and all around the country, how people are building food sovereignty alternatives. So it also empowers activists to understand what is genuine, true agroecology, because there's an attempt to co-opt and capture agroecology. But this guide is meant to assist activists in understanding what true agroecology is, to empower activists to build food sovereignty hubs in their local communities, in their sectors, in different workplaces, to inspire a break, of course, with the corporate controlled food system, the neoliberal food system that is just reproducing hunger and generating the hunger crisis. It has so many inspirational stories, from urban farming to backyard gardens in Jekezi, to rural plots, in schools, as well as in universities, and also how different communities across the country are storing their seeds. There are several other tools that we have developed over the years, of course, like our food sovereignty for the right to food, which is an activist tool really on how to actualize Section 27 of the Constitution, the right to food, how to bring it into reality. The tool addresses that. We have a tool dealing with cooperatives, create work through worker cooperatives. Research has shown that one of the reasons our cooperatives fail is because there's a lack of training, there's a lack of skilling, there's poor management, and there are insufficient resources towards cooperatives. So the tool is a very compact knowledge guide on starting a cooperative, operating a cooperative, the structure of a cooperative, and some of the challenges you can anticipate as a cooperative. We have a tool on seed saving as well, seed sharing, seed storing, our rights to own seeds, our fight against GMO seeds. We have a tool on building people power for water sovereignty, how to democratize our water commons. We have the People's Food Sovereignty Act, and we also have our climate justice tool that we have developed as well. We also have a climate justice through land justice. This particular tool deals with how we'll use land effectively, and also how do we approach issues of land reform, where the debate can be so increasingly toxic. But the tool is about having a progressive approach to the land question, dealing with it and making sure that communities are empowered. And of course, our climate justice charter is our tool as well. Also, the policies that Vish was talking about, they are also tools that are meant to empower activists, that are meant to empower policies, be it our rights of nature tool, that a policy that we've just launched, which has been well received, and we've been receiving responses, and we're continuing with discussions on it, as well as the tool that we are launching today on eco-mobility. So you can find all of these tools, of course. They are available on the SAFC webpage. You can also find them on the CJCM webpage. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you, Charles. I'm just for interest of time, I'm going to pass directly to Awande, who will introduce Lexi's policy.
Thank you, Stacey. And next we have Lexi Diosis, who will be giving a presentation launch of the draft eco-mobility and clean energy public transportation policy. And afterwards, we'll have some time for a brief discussion before we close.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction on Awande. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
The slides.
Yes.
Okay, lovely, cool. So like Awanda said, my name is Lexi. I've been working on developing this, the eco-mobility and clean energy public transport alternatives, both the research behind this policy framework and then this policy framework that is a draft and is being launched today. So I'm curious to hear your feedback and also hope that you will engage with it. Before we get into there we go. Before we get into the policy framework, just really quickly, I want to situate what are transportation emissions and where do they come from? So there's two main drivers. The first is population growth that drives emissions from passenger transport. This is primarily through cars and to some degree through public transportation, but mostly through road passenger vehicles. And then also economic growth, and this comes from non-passenger transport. So that's rail freight, ships, and trucking. Globally, transportation makes up about a quarter of emissions. In South Africa, it's 10% of the total emissions contribution. At a global level, it's 91% dependent on oil, so it's very fossil fuel intense. Globally, 92% of those of the total transport emissions come from passenger road cars, and in South Africa, it's all road vehicles, so that's passenger and non-passenger. So that's private vehicles as well as trucks that are moving goods and freight all over the roads. It's also the fastest growing sector of emissions, and it's on track to intensify, making its decarbonization very important. So through a very large literature review and a policy scan, looking at what other countries are doing, looking at what the context is in South Africa, and basically what needs to happen in order to mobilize a progressive and a democratic and a sustainable transport system. These are four of the key systemic interventions that are kind of framing the rest of this transport policy framework. So the first is to decouple or separate population growth from transportation emissions through eco-mobility approaches, walking and cycling. Population growth can only be, passenger transport emissions can only be separated from population growth through walking and cycling. It's basically the only long-term approach that allows for those emissions from passengers to actually decrease over time. This can happen through policy, through infrastructure changes, through a paradigm shift or a change in thinking and how we think about who has a right to use what on the road. The second key systemic intervention is a rapid decarbonization of existing public transport systems through renewable energy approaches. So this is powering railway systems through solar, through wind energy. There's also a lot of room to explore cleaner fuels such as hydrogen. And this can happen and be mobilized through policy changes, definitely has to happen through infrastructure, but also a systems approach to thinking about renewable energy and public transportation and actually coupling this development. And then also technology development, both preferably in country. So there's opportunities to capture emerging renewable technologies such as electric buses, electric trains, and also cleaner fuel trains. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of exploration going into hydrogen trains. There's also some exploration going into battery trains, as well as other technologies such as wave and electric boats. So there's room there for research and development. And then the third systemic intervention is an immediate shift of passenger and freight transport from road to rail. Building off of what I just said, that 92% of emissions come from road transport in this country. It is absolutely imperative that that transportation shifts over to rail. It's much more sustainable in the long term. It's much more feasible for infrastructure, and it also provides actually for a lot more jobs over the long term. This can happen through policy, through infrastructure, institutional reforms within PROSA and Transnet, and then incentive schemes, and also some bans as well to leverage that, to mobilize that shift. And then lastly, robust engagement with taxi associations and a very, very clear and consistent formalization agenda has got to unfold. So again, policy can shape that, but there has to be very consistent and meaningful stakeholder engagement. Incentives can help facilitate this. And we've also done some research and put some thinking into a kind of a cooperative model that I share a bit more on later. So we've broken up the policy framework into 3 different main roles. There's the role of government, the role of communities, and the role of workplaces and sectors. Arguably, the government, when it comes to the transport sector, has one of the largest and most strategic roles to play in facilitating this transition. So in the actual policy framework document, there's much more in terms of underneath each of these little subheadings, such as bans and disincentives. What I've pulled out here are just examples, so I hope that you read that and really engage with it. But just to give, I guess, kind of a flavor of what's in that document, when it comes to some policy tools that can be mobilized, there are bans and disincentives and also incentive schemes. These are meant to facilitate behavior change. So some of these things can be like tolls and fuel levies for trucks on national highways, can ban tax incentives such as tax credits for purchasing private vehicles. We can change frequent flyer incentives such as these frequent flyer programs that actually reward you for flying more into frequent flyer taxes, and this should be targeted at the wealthy, not 80% of the world's population who's never flown before, but the 20% that's responsible for most aviation emissions. A ban on private jets or heavily tax them and then mobilize those funds into this policy framework and into financing this transition. Can also ban the sales of new internal combustion vehicles by 2030. And I put a question mark there because this is something that's happening as a global trend, but I do think it's worth, really worth critically thinking about and engaging with. And so I'm also curious what others have to hear. And the reason is that in a lot of countries where this is happening, the plan rests on assumption that electric vehicles can basically take their place. And that's not a priority for the climate justice charter movement for a number of reasons that I'll outline a bit later on. But just to say that that's, that this is what the CJC is putting forward and is building, but also that all of these are up for debate and engagement. So incentive schemes, again, these are just a few examples, but rather than having tax credits for purchasing private vehicles, mobilize these into purchasing bicycles that are used for commuting, and also including electric bikes. And then also setting procurement targets, initially for government institutions, but to procure clean energy buses and other mass transport technologies on a regular basis. A lot of other countries in the world have done this on a yearly basis, but to act as also like an implementation strategy to say, we're going to do this and this is how. And you can also use incentives to make these more affordable. So there's other levers here that are also involved in the government's role. Infrastructure probably this is like the biggest lever in terms of facilitating behaviors and lifestyles and actually creating a coherent public transportation system. A lot of this has to do with spatial and land use planning. It has to do with developments. But some of the trends that we're trying to encourage and the spaces that we're trying to create are highly walkable spaces, cyclable spaces. So, and a lot of places this has looked like car-free city centers, car-free streets. Something that's been called into another main theme around infrastructure is really critically engaging with disability access. So I think it's pretty widely known and observed. If you don't design for the needs of the most marginalized first, if you don't design for the needs of people who are disabled in public transport systems, you will not make those systems accessible to people who have disabilities. And in a lot of ways, cars have actually become this technology that's been credited as a savior, especially for people who are disabled, because they allow you to have a lot more autonomy if you can afford one, but they're not affordable to the majority of people. So I think let's rather, instead of prioritizing cars as this tool that can save us, rather say that this is not a democratic technology. And that can really come through with disability access and design in public transportation. Intermodal integration is absolutely critical. So you should be able to get on a bus go to your next route. And then if you need to walk, or you could take a shared bike that's at that next best depot to get where you're going. So a lot of that has to do with visual and land use planning. Or can I just ask someone to mute? I'm not sure who. Thank you. Yeah, so basically making sure that modes are integrated and connected very seamlessly. I already mentioned this, but prioritizing the deployment of renewable energy to power buses and trains. And then also digitization is really important. I mean, people have a right to know, when the bus that they need to take is going to leave, when the train that they need to take is going to leave, and to be able to rely on them and plan their trips, and also pay for their ticketing on mobile applications. And a lot of places we've seen massive like think tank capacity and research capacity that has undertaken very robust research and built a lot of knowledge on the best public transport options in their countries. So we said that these interdisciplinary agendas are super important. And that one of the best ways to do it is through like a national government institute to focus on the key themes that we are putting forth here. But then these should also be available, that knowledge needs to be spread and available across different levels. And there's different ways to do that. So you can have review communities with expertise in this area who are, sitting in different government institutions and sitting on different boards and making sure that what they're approving is also in line with what national government institutes that are focusing on mobilizing this agenda also need. And then through climate crisis planning, you can also dedicate these bridging bodies. Bridging institutions are super important, like I was just saying, but basically institutions that are making sure that across government, different projects that are getting developed, different plans that are being approved, that there's not policy clash between those things, and that we're not financing things that actually have competing priorities. And then a bottom-up national transport just transition strategy that's based on this framework, but also informed by national climate planning and informed by people who are also experiencing climate change right now. So financing this within the role of government, there's a couple different ways that this can happen, and that there are actually a lot of resources that can be mobilized into this. One potential is mobilizing the Road Accident Fund. It's approximately 176 billion rand a year that's spent on cleaning up crashes just in this country. And then requiring development finance institutions to incorporate the CJC systemic alternatives into their project approvals. So really thinking about how sustainable finance can be mobilized, and how are stipulations for the just transition being made in what they approve. Prioritizing the 72.5 billion rand budget towards mobilizing this policy framework, and then also using funds that are raised from disincentives, especially through taxes on the wealthy and also on the private sector. When it comes to technology innovation and creating climate jobs, there is so much potential for electric technologies that are emerging, and for South Africa to capture those markets. So electric ships, they're still in their infancy, but they are rapidly developing. There's been a lot of development into hydrogen trains, into solar locomotives, into battery locomotives. There is electric buses that are already available, as well as hydrogen buses that are already available. And so there is a lot of potential for that manufacturing to start happening in country, as well as heavy duty equipment. I think this is something that often gets overlooked, but we will need some heavy duty equipment. We might need garbage trucks. We might need these other things. And so there is potential also for those that value to be captured. And then there's also, there's a lot of construction potential with building eco-mobility infrastructure, with reconstructing the railway infrastructure. There's a lot that has to go into that. And then also through capturing the bicycle economy, there is such, like, I see it every single day in Cape Town. There are just more and more cyclists, it feels like, everywhere all the time. And a lot of them are riding fancy bikes that are made in Europe, but there is a lot of potential for developing bicycles that can be manufactured here in country for both for recreation and also for commuting. There's a lot of youth unemployment opportunities in bicycle repair. And then, sorry, you'll just have to excuse, it's fitting that the train is going by, but I live by a train station, so you might hear the horn. And also the shared bike and the shared electric bike entrepreneurship. This is something that has exploded in especially the Chinese economy, and that's actually been really captured by young people with both skilled and unskilled skill sets. And then also a lot of zero waste employment through resource reuse, recovery, and redesign, especially when it comes to equipment and manufacturing. On the role of government, last thing here, and then we'll just move on to the last two. There's possibility of exploring more oceans transportation. This is one of the modes. It's actually easier to integrate freight and passenger transport, and it's already happens in a lot of places. And then also just electric ships and ferries. Again, the technology is in their infancy, but the potential is there. When it comes to taxi reform, based off of a lot of research, one of the models that we found that it has a lot of potential is modeled off of what they've done in Kigali. And basically it would involve creating a state cooperative model that's built around different routes in a city and also over longer distances within the country. The government must facilitate tenders for the taxi industry, and how other places have done this, the agreement has basically been that taxi associations provide the capital for the buses, and then the government provides the infrastructure and sets operational standards. And in order for this to work, basically in every single place, it's had to include incentives that benefit taxi associations. They need to be convinced and brought along that they will have stable working conditions and hours, they'll have salaried pay, they'll have healthcare benefits, disability protections, access to financing, and then also that jobs will be available to them. Other jobs besides just driving a bus can also be available to them, such as working in delivery services, and in non-passenger transport, as well as in bus depots and in urban transport systems. And then this has to be digitized and integrated with other modes and ticketing, which that is going to be a challenge in taxi reform, but it's important. Last few things just on the role of communities. Activism has a really big role to play, and just to quickly focus on the Open Streets movement has been very active in Joburg and also in Cape Town, but the theory of change basically rests on that streets are public spaces and cars are not in an equal or democratic use of public space. One car takes up about 80% of road space versus one person on a bike takes up about 3% of road space. So if you just think about it like that, and who can afford a car, and historically who's been able to afford and use and maintain a car, they're not our priority in terms of technology. And then there's also this Bicycle Maros, this African network. They're active in Joburg, they're active in Cape Town, as well as all throughout the African continent. And they push really, really hard for better conditions for cyclists and pedestrians, for safer mobility conditions. And I think engaging with them would be really useful. Why can't I change my slide now? There we go. Lastly, the role of workplaces and sectors. I already covered a lot of what needs to happen in terms of technology, innovation, and the economy, but just to reinforce that there's a lot of potential here for also capturing digital infrastructure and developing that infrastructure, software that needs to be developed to handle the real-time monitoring and deployment of public transportation. And then also the transformation of PRASA and Transnet. So how do we get these institutions to work again, so that new life can be breathed into them? And this idea of transforming them into democratic and digital public utilities, with workers and users of the services being given participation rights in decision-making structures. Last few things that also workplaces can facilitate is involving employees and their students, for universities to be involved in this transition through shifting to teleworking approaches. There's lots of ways that you can also incentivize eco-mobility and public transport approaches, should those alternatives be available to your workers. And then also being involved through a progressive payroll and tax, subsidize these systems and help provide for decommodified transport access. and that these, the transport system should be built on as like part of a trust system. Doesn't need to be policed, but people who can pay do pay. Lastly, in private infrastructure, you can really think about, are my spaces walkable? Are they open to pedestrians and cyclists? Is there bike storage here? Who do I prioritize in the space that I have built? Is it cars or is it somebody on a bike? And so really thinking through those things in any infrastructure that you own, or any organizations, or infrastructure that your organization owns. One thing that was really important for incentivizing, especially employees who work in jobs where maybe they have to have a lot of equipment with them, is providing storage kind of facilities for these employees so they don't have to take it home every single day. And then lastly, working with local governments on the ground to identify like priority infrastructures, especially parking facilities that can be converted to public transportation infrastructure. Okay, last thing is just to ground that the CJCM really has rejected this EVs for everyone approach, and you can read much more about it in the policy framework, but just for these 5 reasons here, that it has the potential to reinforce fossil fuel dependency, creates unnecessary resource competition, reinforces a low density car-centric culture. It does not offer any pathway to equality and is actually anti-democratic in a lot of ways. And there's also the potential for more job creation in the public transport approach rather than sticking with cars. So that's that's everything. I hope that you engage with this and poke some holes in it and take it forward to mobilize it.
Thank you, Lexi. And I also just want to mention that Lexi worked at COPAC and is doing a master's in sustainability at Stellenbosch and is a climate justice activist. So I know we've gone over time. I just want to take just brief inputs before we close. Any questions in the chat or any inputs that anyone would like to make with regards to Lexi's presentation? I'm just sifting through the chat to see if there are any questions for Lexi. I see we have one hand from Mabu Mohale. Mabu, can you please unmute?
Thanks, Comrade Awande. It's Mabu Molele, not Mohale.
Oh, sorry, Mohale.
No, it's okay. I wanted the clarity. I think, Comrade Lexi, thanks for your presentation and even you, Comrade Awande. I saw there's a part there where you spoke about, in terms of your moving everything like from road to rail, if I'm not mistaken. And this was one of the things that we had a concern on or concern about, as Comrade Kamo had that it's not only like in Sata, we've got different sectors that we are organizing in, and a road freight is one of those. So I remember this was also raised in one of our discussions, even one of the document that Comrade Zico was preparing to say, this when you talk about moving, or in terms of your national rail policy that puts more interest on your private sector or private investors, they're talking about moving everything from like the road to the rail. And in this case, then it means that our comrades from the road freight, which is your truck drivers, and then the concern is, where will these guys find themselves? As much as, yes, that will then move, that means that your rail needs to improve in terms of making sure that the services that they are currently rendering or they're giving towards the communities and all that, they'll have to improve so that people don't find themselves stranded and all that. It becomes the public transport that will be reliable and but it still does not address the concerns about your comrades or our comrades that are in the road right? To say, what will then happen if we are saying, like, we get it right? Let's say we get it right to say everything moves away. We don't need all these trucks, you know, going up and down, you're moving the cargo and all that. We are taking everything, go there to translate and all that. What will then happen to this comrades? So I missed that part. I just see like, or maybe another thing that I'm comfortable with is to say that you're saying we can also go through these documents and maybe give our input, like going forward, that we can do. Because I remember there was a concern around there to say, if everything now is focusing, or we are saying we're moving everything away off the road so that we can have less congestion and all that on the road, this problem that we are currently facing, or the fear that the comrades in the road freight are faced with, what will then happen to them, or how is that going to be addressed? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. It has been something on my mind of just thinking about how many people do work in road freight in this country. I mean, so yeah, to also just say that this document is available for public engagement. So take it, I mean, take it to your next meeting and feel free to poke some holes in it and, you know, really engage with it. And also, and propose alternatives as well. Something that I also would be curious to know is that, you know, I mean, there are a lot of trucks on this road, but there's also serious impacts to roads, especially because South Africa has really high weight standards compared to a lot of the rest of the world for how much a truck can be loaded with. I think it's 56,000 kilograms, which is like, it's like 55% higher than the US and the EU than a lot of these other countries. And then on top of that, there's also a lot of overloading in these trucks, which one contributes to deadly crashes. And then two, it also contributes to a lot of disrepair on the roads. So some roads that, you know, if they regularly have these trucks driving on them that are overloaded and already starting at a high baseline, these roads, and it'll basically it limits their lifeline, or their lifetime basically by like 50%, so they will last half as long as they're meant to. So that's another thing to consider, just in terms of like financing that's going into road infrastructure. But in terms of what happens to workers who are in road freight, I mean, one, I think they should need to be first priorities for workers who are being transitioned to rail freight and into other sectors. But I hope that you take this document back. And I'm also very curious, like, you know, think about what working conditions are like for road freight employees currently. Do they feel safe? Are they pressured? Do they feel that they're being paid adequately for the work that they do? And are there other opportunities in this policy framework that can be mobilized based on their concerns?
Thank you, Lexi. I don't see any other hands or comments. So before I hand over, Lexi, would you like to make any final inputs in closing? Okay, well, thank you, Lexi, for a very comprehensive presentation on eco-mobility and public transportation. And now I'll hand over to Vish for the closing and way forward.
Comrades, a big thank you to all of you. I'm going to switch off my video. Comrades, thank you to all the trade union leaders who made the time tonight to come and share with us. You know, we've got a whole list of challenges that have come through. I mean, this ranges from, you know, the challenge of education in schools and the work being done there, climate jobs, you know, CETAs and the training system, the poly crisis and its squeeze on workers, the need for a more pro-worker discourse to come out around the just transition. We have an unjust transition, and we all agree on that. We need to have social and labor plans more effectively deployed and driven by workers. We need to think about this energy transition a bit more carefully. We know the Just Energy Transition Plan is skewed against us. We know that finance issues are highly contentious. And of course, Eskom is in trouble, but we also need a clear approach and a way forward for Eskom. And there are challenges in a whole set of other policies as national rail policy, and so on. So this was all articulated by yourselves. And I'm sure there's other concerns and there's other challenges. And so tonight, comrades, we want to cement this relationship with you. The tools we are sharing, the activist tools, the policy tools, the CJ deal tool is all about accelerating the just transition in the interests of workers, the poor, and the most vulnerable in our country. What we want to do out of tonight's engagement, comrades, is invite you to travel with us. We are having a conference in October, 16th to 19th, as the Climate Justice Charter Movement. As we build up to that conference, we'll be releasing more policies. There's going to be a flurry of such policies coming through, all drafts, all open for engagement. A lot of hard thinking has gone into them. And we'd really, really like your feedback. And so we want to convene on a monthly basis, the last Tuesday of every month. And we'd like to invite you to come. And firstly, give us an update. Let's talk challenges around the just transition. So many of you are sitting in different policy processes. You're going to NEDLAC, you're involved in your enterprise, whether it's ESCOM, wherever you are, you're engaging in policy debates in your sector, etc. Let's bring that into a collective conversation. If you don't share information with us, and of course, we don't share information with you, none of us are going to know what's happening around the just transition. So our first ask is let's sit together in solidarity and share information around the just transition, where are the obstacles, where are the challenges, and strategize together. Our second ask, comrades, is for you to give us feedback on these policies. So if any one of you, unions, I'm hoping SATAU takes this up, and any other union, please take the transport policy, take our rights of nature policy, debate it, workshop it, and we really welcome your feedback. Nothing is set in stone. And please inform us before the last Tuesday of June, and we'll create a panel so that we get your feedback in a proper structured process. It's a respectful process. We respect your ideas, your feedback, and we create the space for that to happen. The other point about the forum we want to institutionalize with you, comrades, is that today we just gave you a glimpse of our tools. Maybe what we want to do next time round is look at an action program. How do we now start working together to take the planning tool into your workplaces? Let's start talking about that. How can we take our other tools, our food tools? We're developing a decarbonization tool. We even have some draft work on that. And we could share that with you, and you could come back with your ideas. So we start co-creating these tools, these education tools, popular education tools that can help workers, can inform workers, etc. So we want to develop a program with you to roll out those tools, work together. We're happy to come to your workplaces. We're happy to come and do workshops. We're happy to have you come into our spaces and to deepen this relationship. So comrades, is this acceptable to everyone? Can we convene the last Tuesday of every month? We've got your contact information. And of course, the invite is extended to as many workers and trade unions as possible. Any feedback on that proposal, comrades, before we close tonight? Mabu, go ahead.
Yes, Prof. No, on our side, I think we would not have an issue with that. That would be very productive and very progressive on our side if we were to see things that we want to achieve together, working together. We can definitely avail ourselves, and I will also go and encourage more of our comrades to kind of like come through and join this platform so that they can also, give in their inputs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mabu. Zico? Comrade Zico?
Yeah, thanks, Comrade Vish. Well, Mabu has already covered me. We will participate in this, and I'm happy about this last Tuesday of the month activities you have talked about. As Mabu has said, and as you have proposed, that we must mobilize more workers to join in. As I finally managed to join, one comrade was also criticizing me for not sharing this with him. But yes, I promise that I will share this with with our national sector coordinators and shop stewards. This one, I thought it was restricted to a particular audience. And also, just to, as I struggle to connect, I hope Comrade Kamu did do the SATAW input, because I informed you late that he was the one, not me, who was gonna present on behalf of SATAW. I hope he managed to do that.
I know
But
he did.
will be part of the program, Comrade Vish. We endorse the proposal you've made.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, comrades. I'm not hearing any other dissenting voices. So comrades, I'm assuming that we can regularize this interaction the last Tuesday of every month, late afternoon, early evening, and then we continue to deepen our relationship. We build solidarity. We have a common cause, comrades. The climate crisis, the poly crisis is worsening, but there are answers. And together we can put those answers together and we can fight for them. Comrades, good night and take care. And once again, thank you for your time and see you in June. Amandla.
Aluta continue,
Night,
comrades.
good night.
Yeah,